His hands tremble as they reach toward his face. 5 years of darkness. His fingers press against his eyelids, and for the first time, he tries to lift them. The woman beside him holds her breath. What she's about to see will explain everything. Why a billionaire's son chose blindness over sight. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and Nia stepped into a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and expensive wood polish. She carried a single duffel bag over her shoulder and a folder of paperwork that felt heavier than it should. The agency had told her this was a private care position, live-in, decent pay, but they hadn't told her much else. Just an address in the financial district, a penthouse apartment, and a name. Marcus Thornton. 28 years old. Requires full-time assistance. The woman who answered the door was older, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back tight and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. She introduced herself as Mrs. Brennan, the house manager, and she didn't smile. She stepped aside and gestured for Nia to enter. The apartment was massive, all floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the city skyline, modern furniture in grays and whites, art on the walls that probably cost more than Nia's car. But despite all the luxury, something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet, like the whole place was holding its breath. Mrs. Brennan led her down a long hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She didn't make small talk. She just walked, and Nia followed, taking in the framed photographs on the walls. A distinguished older man in a suit, silver-haired and severe-looking. The same man with a younger version of himself, a boy with bright eyes and a wide smile. And then another photo, more recent, of a young man in a hospital bed, his eyes closed, tubes and wires everywhere. Mrs. Brennan stopped at a door at the end of the hall and turned to face Nia. Her expression was unreadable. She said this was Marcus's room, and before Nia went in, there were things she needed to understand. Marcus Thornton was the only son of Gerald Thornton, one of the wealthiest men in the state. 5 years ago, Marcus was in a car accident, traumatic brain injury. He'd been in a coma for 6 months, and when he finally emerged from it, he never opened his eyes. Not once. The doctor said there was no physical reason for it. His eyelids functioned normally, his brain scans showed activity, but he simply wouldn't open them. Over the years, they'd tried everything. Therapy, medication, surgery consultations, specialists from around the world. Nothing worked. Marcus could hear. He could move a little. He could even speak in short, broken sentences, but his eyes stayed shut. Mrs. Brennan's voice dropped lower. She said, Gerald Thornton was a difficult man, demanding and cold, and he'd given up on his son a long time ago. He paid for the best care, the best equipment, but he rarely visited. Once a month, maybe. And he never stayed long. She said Nia was the 7th caregiver in 2 years. The others hadn't lasted. Some couldn't handle the isolation. Others couldn't deal with Gerald's temper, and one had quit after a single day without explanation. Mrs. Brennan opened the door, and Nia's breath caught. The room was dimmed, heavy curtains drawn, and in the center was a hospital bed with rails. A young man lay there, his skin pale against the white sheets, his dark hair longer than it should be, falling across his forehead. His eyes were closed, and his face looked almost peaceful, like he was sleeping. But there was something about the way he held himself, a tension in his jaw, a tightness in his shoulders, that made Nia think he wasn't peaceful at all. Next to the bed was a chair, a small table with medications, monitors beeping softly, and a large window that would have had a beautiful view if the curtains weren't closed. Mrs. Brennan explained Nia's duties in a flat, businesslike tone. Basic care, feeding, physical therapy exercises, keeping him clean, monitoring vitals, administering medications on schedule. She said Marcus didn't talk much, and when he did, it was usually just a word or two. She said not to take it personally. She said not to ask him questions about the accident. And she said, most importantly, Gerald Thornton expected updates twice a week and absolute discretion. No press, no social media, No sharing details with anyone outside this apartment. Nia nodded, though her mind was racing. Mrs. Brennan left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Nia stood there for a moment, alone with Marcus, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. She set her bag down and approached the bed slowly. Up close, she could see more details. The faint scar along his right temple, the way his hands rested on his stomach, fingers loosely curled, the slight movement of his chest as he breathed. She said hello, her voice quiet but clear. She told him her name was Nia, and she'd be taking care of him from now on. She said she knew this was probably awkward, having a stranger in his space, but she promised to do her best to make things comfortable. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, so faint she almost missed it, his lips moved. He whispered something. Not a greeting, not her name, just a single word. Go. Nia felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't move. She took a breath and said she understood this was hard, but she was here to help. She said she wasn't going anywhere. His jaw clenched, and his hands tightened into fists. But he didn't say anything else. Over the next few days, Nia settled into a routine. She woke early, prepared Marcus's breakfast, a soft meal he could manage without much chewing, and helped him sit up to eat. He cooperated mostly, but he never spoke. When she asked questions, he either ignored her or gave one-word answers. Yes. Number. Fine. Sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes. She learned quickly that he didn't like being touched more than necessary. When she adjusted his pillows or helped him shift position, he flinched, just barely. But enough for her to notice. She started narrating what she was going to do before she did it, giving him time to prepare. It seemed to help, a little. The apartment felt like a tomb. Mrs. Brennan came and went, handling household matters. But she rarely spoke to Nia beyond necessary instructions. There were no other staff, no visitors. Just Nia and Marcus and the endless quiet. At night, Nia stayed in a small room adjacent to Marcus's, the door left open so she could hear if he needed anything. But he never called out. He just lay there, eyes closed, silent. She'd lie awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of life this was. For him. For her. On the 5th day, something changed. Nia was cleaning up after lunch, putting away dishes, when she heard a sound from Marcus's room. A soft thud. She rushed in and found him on the floor beside the bed, his legs tangled in the sheets, his body trembling. She dropped to her knees beside him, her heart pounding, and asked if he was hurt. He didn't answer. His breathing was fast, panicked, and his hands were pressed against his face, covering his eyes. She reached out carefully, not touching him, just close enough to let him know she was there. She spoke in a low, steady voice. She said it was okay. She was going to help him back to bed, but first she needed to know if he was in pain. For a moment, he just shook his head. Then, his voice cracked as he whispered that he couldn't see. He said it again, louder, more desperate. He couldn't see. Nia's mind raced. Of course he couldn't see. His eyes were closed. But the way he said it, the terror in his voice, made her realize something. He wasn't talking about now. He was remembering. She asked gently if he wanted to talk about it, but he shook his head violently. He said no, over and over, and she didn't push. She just helped him back into bed, slow and careful, and stayed beside him until his breathing steadied. That night, after he'd fallen asleep, Nia sat in her room with her phone, scrolling through old news articles. She found the story of the accident easily. 5 years ago, Marcus Thornton had been driving late at night when his car was hit by a drunk driver. The other driver died on impact. Marcus barely survived. The articles mentioned his injuries, his coma, his miraculous but incomplete recovery, but there was something else, buried in a smaller article from a few months later. A custody battle. Marcus had a daughter, a little girl named Zoe, 4 years old at the time of the accident. Her mother, a woman named Shanice, had taken Zoe and disappeared shortly after Marcus went into the coma. Gerald Thornton had tried to fight for custody, claiming Shanice was unfit, but the case was dropped after Shanice agreed to stay away in exchange for a settlement. Nia stared at the screen, her chest tight. Marcus had a daughter, and he hadn't seen her in 5 years. The next morning, Nia didn't mention what she'd found. She went through the routine as usual, but she watched Marcus more closely. The way he tensed whenever she mentioned anything about the outside world. The way his hands sometimes moved toward his face, then stopped, like he was fighting an instinct. She started talking to him more, not asking questions, just filling the silence with small things, stories from her own life, descriptions of the weather, random thoughts. At first he didn't respond, but after a few days, she noticed small changes, a slight tilt of his head when she said something interesting, a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth when she made a joke, and once, just once, he whispered something back. He said her voice was nice. It was progress. 2 weeks in, Gerald Thornton made his monthly visit. Nia heard him before she saw him, his voice booming down the hallway, barking orders at Mrs. Brennan. When he entered Marcus's room, he barely glanced at Nia. He was tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that filled a room. His suit was perfectly tailored, his watch probably worth more than Nia's yearly salary. He stood at the foot of Marcus's bed, arms crossed, and looked down at his son like he was inspecting a broken piece of furniture. He asked Mrs. Brennan for updates, not Marcus. He asked about vitals, medications, any changes. Mrs. Brennan rattled off answers in a clipped tone. Gerald nodded, then turned to leave. That was it. No greeting, no touch, no attempt to connect. As he reached the door, Marcus's voice, barely audible, cut through the silence. He said one word. Dad. Gerald stopped. For a second, Nia thought he might turn around. But he didn't. He just kept walking. The door closed behind him, and the room fell silent again. Nia looked at Marcus. His hands were clenched tight against his sides, and his jaw was set hard. She wanted to say something. Anything. But no words felt right. That night, Marcus spoke more than he had in weeks. It was late, the apartment dark and quiet, and Nia was sitting in her room reading when she heard him call out. Not loud, just a soft sound, almost like he was testing if she'd hear. She went to him immediately. He was lying on his back, eyes still closed, but his face was turned toward her. He asked if she was still awake. She said yes. He asked if she'd sit with him for a while. She pulled the chair close to his bed and sat down. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, Marcus started talking. His voice was quiet, halting, like he was pulling words from somewhere deep and painful. He told her about the accident. Not the details, not the crash itself, but what came after. He said when he woke up from the coma, the first thing he saw was his father's face. Gerald had been standing over him, and the look in his eyes wasn't relief or love. It was disappointment. Like Marcus surviving was somehow the wrong outcome. He said the doctors told him he'd been in the coma for 6 months, and in that time, everything had fallen apart. Shanice was gone. Zoe was gone. His life, whatever it had been, was over. He said he tried to hold it together at first. He did the therapy, took the medications, followed every instruction. But every time he opened his eyes, he saw the same thing. Pity. Disgust. Disappointment. From the doctors, from the nurses, from his father. And one day he just couldn't do it anymore. He closed his eyes, and he didn't open them again. Nia felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. Marcus said he knew it didn't make sense. He knew it was irrational, but keeping his eyes closed felt like the only control he had left. If he couldn't see the world couldn't see him. And maybe, just maybe, if he stayed like this long enough, everyone would forget he existed. Nia asked, her voice gentle, if he'd thought about Zoe. Marcus's face crumpled. He said every day. He said he didn't even know what she looked like now. She'd be 9 years old. He didn't know if she remembered him. He didn't know if Shanice told her the truth or if she grew up thinking he'd abandoned her. The not knowing was worse than anything else. Nia reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. She said she couldn't imagine how hard this was, but she believed he was stronger than he thought. She said Zoe deserved to know her father, and he deserved a chance to be in her life. Marcus's voice broke. He said it was too late, even if he wanted to find her. Even if he could somehow get past everything. Shanice had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him or his family. And he couldn't blame her. Gerald had tried to take Zoe away. He'd hired lawyers, threatened her, made her life hell. Of course she ran. They sat in silence for a while, Nia's hand still resting on his. Finally, she asked if he'd ever tried to reach out to Shanice directly, not through lawyers, not through his father, just him. Marcus shook his head. He said he wouldn't even know where to start. Nia thought about this. Then, carefully, she asked if he'd want her to try. Marcus's eyes, still closed, seemed to tighten. He asked why she'd do that. She said because everyone deserved a second chance, and because she had a daughter too, and she couldn't imagine being kept from her. Marcus turned his head toward her, and for the first time, she saw something shift in his expression. Hope, maybe. Or fear. He asked if she really thought it was possible. Nia said she didn't know, but she could try. Over the next few weeks, Nia started digging. She used her off hours to search online, combing through social media, public records, anything she could find. Shanice's trail was faint, but not impossible to follow. She'd changed her last name, moved to a smaller city a few hours away, and by all accounts she was working as a nurse. Nia found a profile that looked promising, a woman around the right age with a daughter who'd be about 9. She stared at the small profile picture for a long time. The woman was beautiful, with warm eyes and a guarded smile. The little girl beside her had Marcus's dark hair and his sharp jawline. There was no mistaking it. That was Zoe. Nia didn't tell Marcus right away. She needed to be sure. She reached out to Shanice through a careful, neutral message. She didn't mention Marcus or Gerald. She just said she was a caregiver working with someone who cared deeply about reconnecting with family, and she wondered if Shanice might be open to a conversation. The response came 3 days later. Short, wary. Shanice asked who this was really about. Nia took a breath and told the truth. She said she was taking care of Marcus, and he wanted a chance to see his daughter again. Shanice's next message was colder. She said Marcus had his chance. She said his father tried to destroy her, and she wasn't going to let that man anywhere near Zoe. Nia wrote back quickly. She said she understood, and she wasn't asking on behalf of Gerald. She said Marcus hadn't seen his father in any meaningful way in years. She said he'd been through hell, and all he wanted was a chance to explain, to apologize, to be part of Zoe's life if Shanice would allow it. There was a long pause. Then Shanice asked what was wrong with Marcus. Why couldn't he reach out himself? Nia hesitated. Then she explained as gently as she could about the accident, the coma, the fact that Marcus hadn't opened his eyes in 5 years. She said he was trying to heal, but it was hard, and he needed something to fight for. Shanice's response was a single question. Does he really want to see her? Or does he just feel guilty? Nia thought about this carefully before answering. She said both, probably. But that didn't make it any less real. Days passed with no response. Nia didn't mention any of this to Marcus yet. She didn't want to give him hope just to have it crushed. But she could see him changing. He was talking more, asking questions about her life, even laughing softly at her jokes. It was like knowing there was a possibility, even if he didn't know the details, had shifted something in him. Then one evening, Nia's phone buzzed, a message from Shanice. She said she'd thought about it, and she was willing to meet. Just her and Nia, no Marcus, no Gerald. She wanted to talk first, to understand what was really going on. If she felt comfortable after that, maybe, she'd consider letting Zoe and Marcus reconnect. Nia's hands shook as she typed back. She agreed to the terms and set a date. When she told Marcus, his reaction was immediate. His whole body went rigid, and his voice came out choked. He asked if Shanice had really agreed. Nia said yes, but she was cautious. She reminded him this wasn't a guarantee, just a first step. Marcus nodded, but she could see the tension in every line of his body. He asked what he should do, how he could prepare. Nia said the best thing he could do was keep working on himself, keep talking, keep trying. And when the time came, if it came, he needed to be ready to be honest. The meeting with Shanice was in a quiet coffee shop halfway between the city and her town. Nia arrived early, her nerves buzzing. When Shanice walked in, Nia recognized her immediately. She was striking, composed, but there was a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there in the old photos. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Shanice asked, point blank, what Marcus wanted. Nia explained everything. The accident, the coma, the years of isolation, the refusal to open his eyes. She talked about how Marcus blamed himself, how he believed Shanice and Zoe were better off without him, how Gerald's interference had poisoned everything. She said Marcus wasn't asking for forgiveness. Not really. He just wanted Zoe to know he hadn't abandoned her, that he thought about her every day. Shanice listened, her expression unreadable. When Nia finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd spent 5 years trying to protect Zoe from the Thornton family. She said Gerald had threatened to take her daughter, to prove Shanice was an unfit mother, to tear apart her life. She said the only reason she'd agreed to disappear was to give Zoe a chance at a normal childhood, away from that world. Nia said she understood. She said Gerald wasn't part of this. She said Marcus barely spoke to his father, and if Shanice allowed contact, it would be on her terms, completely. Shanice looked down at her coffee cup. She said Zoe asked about her father sometimes. Not often, but enough that it hurt. She said she told Zoe that Marcus had been very sick, and that's why he couldn't be there. She hadn't told her about the custody battle or the threats. She wanted Zoe to have good memories, even if they were based on hope more than reality. Nia asked if Zoe knew what Marcus looked like. Shanice pulled out her phone and showed Nia a picture. It was an old photo from before the accident of Marcus holding baby Zoe. He was smiling, his whole face lit up with joy. Nia's throat tightened. She said that man was still in there, under all the pain and fear. He just needed a reason to come back. Shanice took a shaky breath. She said she'd think about it. She said she needed to talk to Zoe first, to see how she felt. But she wasn't making any promises. Nia thanked her and they parted ways. When Nia got back to the apartment, Marcus was waiting, his whole body tense with anticipation. She told him everything, and when she finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly, he asked if Shanice hated him. Nia said no. She said Shanice was scared, and she had every right to be. But she didn't hate him. Marcus's hands moved to his face, and for a moment, Nia thought he might try to open his eyes. But he didn't. He just pressed his palms against his eyelids and whispered that he didn't deserve this chance. Nia said maybe not. But Zoe deserved a father. And that was what mattered. A week later, Shanice called. She said she'd talked to Zoe, and Zoe wanted to meet her dad. But there were conditions. The meeting would be brief, supervised, and in a neutral location. If Marcus did anything to upset Zoe or make her uncomfortable, it would be over. And Gerald Thornton was not to know. Nia agreed to everything. When she told Marcus, he broke down. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears slipping from beneath his closed eyelids. He said he didn't know if he could do this. He didn't know if Zoe would even recognize him. Nia said it didn't matter if she recognized him. What mattered was showing up. The day of the meeting, Nia helped Marcus get ready. She'd arranged for a private room in a family counseling center, neutral and safe. Marcus was shaking as they drove there, his hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair Nia had insisted on bringing just in case. When they arrived, Shanice was already there with Zoe. The little girl was small for 9, with big curious eyes and her hair pulled back in 2 puffs. She looked at Marcus with a mix of confusion and interest, and Nia's heart ached. Shanice guided Zoe into the room, and Nia stepped back to give them space. Marcus sat in a chair, his eyes still closed, his hands folded in his lap. Zoe approached slowly, her mother's hand on her shoulder. She stopped a few feet away and asked, in a small voice, if he was really her dad. Marcus's voice cracked when he answered. He said yes. He said he was so sorry he hadn't been there. He said he'd thought about her every single day. Zoe tilted her head, studying him. She asked why his eyes were closed. Marcus hesitated. Then, with a shaky breath, he told her the truth. He said after the accident, he'd been very scared and very sad, and closing his eyes made him feel safer. But he was trying to get better. He was trying to be brave. Zoe thought about this. Then she said her mom told her he was sick. She asked if he was still sick. Marcus said a little bit, but he was working on it. Zoe stepped closer. She reached out and touched his hand, just lightly. She said he felt real. Marcus let out a choked laugh and said he was definitely real. They talked for a while, awkward and tentative, but real. Zoe told him about school, about her favorite books, about the kitten Shanice had let her adopt. Marcus listened, his face a mixture of pain and joy. When it was time to go, Zoe asked if she could see him again. Marcus looked toward Shanice, even though he couldn't see her. Shanice's voice was soft when she said they'd talk about it. As they left, Zoe turned back and said goodbye, and Marcus whispered it back, his voice barely holding together. When they were gone, Marcus sat in silence for a long time. Nia didn't say anything. She just waited. Finally, Marcus spoke. He said he wanted to try. He said he wanted to open his eyes. He said he was terrified, but he couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't miss Zoe's life. Nia asked if he was sure. He nodded. They went back to the apartment, and that night, Nia sat with Marcus in his room. He was lying in bed, his hands clenched at his sides, his whole body rigid with fear. She asked if he wanted her to stay. He said yes. He said he didn't think he could do this alone. Nia pulled the chair close and took his hand. She said there was no rush. Whenever he was ready. Marcus took a deep breath. Then another. His hands moved to his face, trembling. He pressed his fingers against his eyelids, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, painfully, he started to lift them. The light was dim, just a soft glow from the bedside lamp, but even that seemed too bright. Marcus flinched, his eyes slamming shut again. He gasped, his breath coming fast. Nia squeezed his hand. She said it was okay. She said he could try again when he was ready. Marcus shook his head. He said no, he had to do this now. He took another breath and tried again. This time his eyelids fluttered open. Just a crack. Nia saw his eyes for the first time. Dark and wide and terrified. He blinked rapidly, his face contorting in pain, or fear, or both. She said softly that she was right there. That he was safe. Marcus's eyes focused on her, and for a second he just stared. Then his face crumpled, and he started to cry. Not quiet tears this time, but deep, wrenching sobs. Nia didn't let go of his hand. She just stayed there, holding on as he fell apart. When he finally calmed down, his eyes were red and swollen, but they were open. He looked around the room, taking in everything like it was the first time. The monitors, the window, the curtains. Then he looked back at Nia. He said, his voice hoarse, that he'd forgotten what the world looked like. Nia smiled through her own tears and said the world had been waiting for him. Over the next few days, Marcus kept his eyes open more and more, though it was still hard. Bright lights hurt. Sudden movements made him dizzy. And sometimes, when the fear got too strong, he'd close them again and need time before he could try once more. But he kept trying. Nia helped him adjust, dimming lights, covering the windows during the day, giving him sunglasses for when he needed them. She celebrated every small victory. The first time he looked out the window. The first time he watched TV. The first time he smiled at something he saw. And through it all, they talked. Marcus told her more about his life before the accident, about how he'd met Shanice, about the night Zoe was born, about the dreams he'd had that all fell apart. Nia told him about her own daughter, about the struggles she'd faced, about why she'd taken this job. They became friends, real friends, and the apartment stopped feeling like a tomb. Shanice agreed to more visits. At first, they were short, an hour here and there, always supervised. But Zoe started to relax around Marcus, started to open up. She told him about her friends, about the books she loved, about the things that scared her. Marcus listened to every word like it was the most important thing he'd ever heard. One afternoon, Zoe asked why he hadn't been there when she was little. Shanice tensed, ready to intervene, but Marcus answered honestly. He said he'd made mistakes. He said his family had made things complicated, and he hadn't been strong enough to fight for her the way he should have. He said he was sorry, and he understood if she was angry. Zoe thought about this. Then she said she wasn't really angry. She was just sad. She said she used to pretend he was a superhero who was away saving people, and that's why he couldn't visit. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. He said he wished he'd been that brave, but he was going to try to be now. Zoe smiled, a small, tentative thing, and said that was good enough. As the weeks passed, Marcus grew stronger. Physically, mentally, emotionally. He started doing more physical therapy, pushing himself harder than he had in years. He started talking about the future, about things he wanted to do, places he wanted to take Zoe. He even started standing up to Gerald. When his father made one of his rare visits, Marcus met his eyes for the first time in 5 years and told him he was done living under his shadow. He said he was going to rebuild his life, and Gerald could either be part of it or not. But either way, Marcus wasn't asking for permission. Gerald looked shocked, then angry, then something else. Something Naya couldn't quite read. He left without a word, and Marcus sat down heavily, exhausted, but triumphant. Naya told him she was proud of him. Marcus said he couldn't have done any of this without her. But there was still one major obstacle. The reason Marcus had closed his eyes in the first place wasn't just fear or trauma. It was something else, something he hadn't told anyone. One night, after Zoe had gone home and the apartment was quiet, Marcus finally told Nia the truth. He said that when he woke up from the coma, the doctors ran tests. Lots of tests, and they found something. There was damage to his optic nerves, subtle but present. They told him that eventually, over time, he might lose his vision completely. It could be 5 years, 10 years, 20. They didn't know, but it was likely. Marcus said he'd closed his eyes because he thought if he never got used to seeing, then losing his sight wouldn't hurt as much. If he lived in darkness by choice, then when it became permanent, it wouldn't matter. Nia stared at him, her heart breaking. She asked if the doctors were sure. Marcus said no, it was a possibility, not a certainty. But the fear had been enough. Naya asked if he regretted opening his eyes now, knowing what might happen. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and said no. He said even if he only had a few more years of sight, he wanted to see Zoe grow up. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to live. They sat together in the quiet, and Nia felt the weight of what he'd shared. She said that whatever happened, he wouldn't face it alone. Marcus nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he looked at peace. The next few months were the best Marcus had experienced in years. Zoe's visits became more frequent, and she started staying overnight sometimes, sleeping in a guest room that Nia and Marcus had decorated together. Shanice even started warming up to Marcus again, seeing how much effort he was putting in, how genuine his love for Zoe was. One evening, after Zoe had fallen asleep, Shanice and Marcus sat together in the living room. It was awkward at first, both of them carrying years of hurt and resentment. But they talked, really talked. Shanice told him how hard it had been, raising Zoe alone, always looking over her shoulder, afraid Gerald would find them. Marcus apologized, over and over, for not protecting her from his father, for not being strong enough back then. Shanice said she'd been angry at him for a long time, but seeing him now, seeing how much he'd changed, it was hard to hold on to that anger. She said she didn't know if they could ever be what they were before, but maybe they could be something new. Marcus said he'd like that. They agreed to take things slow, to focus on co-parenting. on giving Zoe the stability she deserved. And for the first time in 5 years, Marcus felt like he had a family again. But then, something shifted. Gerald started showing up more often, not to see Marcus, but to talk to Mrs. Brennan, to ask questions, to hover. Marcus grew uneasy. He didn't trust his father's sudden interest. One afternoon, Gerald cornered Marcus in his room. He said he'd heard about the visits with Zoe, about Shanice coming around. He said he was glad Marcus was doing better, but there were concerns. Legal concerns. He said Shanice had signed an agreement years ago to stay away, and by rekindling contact, she might be violating those terms. Marcus felt ice in his veins. He said Shanice hadn't violated anything. The agreement was coerced, and she had every right to let him see his daughter. Gerald said it wasn't that simple. He said the agreement protected the family, and if Shanice was going to be involved, there needed to be new terms, new conditions. Marcus realized what his father was doing. He was trying to control the situation, to insert himself back into power. Marcus said no. He said this was his life, his daughter, and Gerald didn't get a say. Gerald's expression darkened. He said Marcus was still legally under his financial care, still dependent on the family trust for his medical expenses, his living situation. He said if Marcus wanted to keep making decisions, he'd need to prove he was capable of independence. Marcus felt the world tilt. He'd been so focused on healing, on reconnecting with Zoe, that he hadn't thought about the practicalities. He had no income, no savings of his own. Everything was controlled by Gerald. Nia, who'd been listening from the hallway, stepped in. She said Marcus was more capable than Gerald gave him credit for. She said he'd made more progress in a few months than in 5 years, and that was because he finally had something to fight for. Gerald looked at her coldly. He said she was just the help, and this wasn't her concern. Nia held her ground. She said she'd seen Marcus at his lowest, and she'd seen him rise. She said Gerald didn't get to take that away. Gerald left, but the damage was done. Marcus spiraled. He started doubting everything again, wondering if he'd been naive to think he could build a life independent of his father. Nia tried to reassure him, but the fear was back in his eyes. That night, Marcus asked Nia if she thought he could really do this, if he could be a father, support himself, live without his eyes closing again when things got hard. Nia said she knew he could, but he had to believe it too. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He called a lawyer, independent of Gerald's firm, and started the process of legally separating his finances. It would take time and it would be complicated, but it was possible. He also reached out to old contacts from before the accident, people who'd worked with him, people who believed in him. He started exploring options for work, for building something of his own. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was taking control of his life. Shanice, when he told her, was cautiously supportive. She said she didn't want Zoe caught in the middle of a battle between Marcus and Gerald. But she admired him for trying. Nia helped every step of the way. She researched resources, made calls, coordinated appointments. She became more than a caregiver. She became his advocate. But as Marcus's independence grew, so did Gerald's interference. He started cutting off access to certain accounts, delaying payments, creating obstacles. He told Mrs. Brennan to report everything Marcus did, every visitor, every plan. Marcus felt the pressure mounting. One night he broke down. He told Nia he didn't know if he was strong enough to fight his father. He said maybe it would be easier to just give in, to let Gerald control things, to keep the peace. Nia looked at him hard. She said she'd watched him fight every day to open his eyes, to face his fears, to be a father to Zoe. She said he was strong enough. But he had to decide if he wanted to be free or if he wanted to be safe. Marcus thought about this for a long time. Then he said he wanted to be free. The turning point came during another visit with Zoe. She asked Marcus if he was okay, said he seemed sad. Marcus didn't want to burden her with adult problems, but he also didn't want to lie. He said he was dealing with some hard things, but he was going to figure it out. Zoe asked if it was because of her grandpa. Marcus was surprised. He asked what she meant. Zoe said her mom had told her that Grandpa Gerald had tried to take her away once, and that's why they'd left. She said she didn't really know him, but she didn't like him very much. Marcus felt a surge of protectiveness. He said Zoe didn't have to worry about Gerald. He said he'd make sure she was safe, no matter what. Zoe hugged him, and Marcus held her tight. He realized then that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting Zoe, about showing her that you could stand up to people who tried to control you. He couldn't let Gerald win. With Nia's help, Marcus accelerated his plans. He found a small consulting opportunity, something he could do from home, using his business background. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He also formalized a co-parenting agreement with Shanice, one that gave him legal rights without Gerald's interference. When Gerald found out, he was furious. He threatened to cut Marcus off completely, to force him to move out of the apartment, to make his life hell. Marcus stood his ground. He said he'd live in a studio apartment if he had to. He'd work whatever job he could find, but he wasn't going to be controlled anymore. Gerald, for the first time, seemed to realize Marcus was serious. His expression shifted, something almost like respect flickering across his face. But then it hardened again. He said Marcus would regret this, and he left. The following weeks were tense. Marcus moved into a smaller apartment, one he could afford with his consulting income. It was a huge downgrade from the penthouse, but it was his. Nia helped him move, and when everything was set up, Marcus looked around and smiled. He said it felt like freedom. Zoe loved the new place. It was cozier, more lived in, more like a real home. She helped Marcus decorate, picking out colors and arranging furniture. Shanice even stopped by a few times. And slowly, they started to feel like a family. Nia continued to check in, though her official caregiving duties had ended. She and Marcus had become true friends, and she wasn't about to abandon him now. One afternoon, Marcus asked Nia why she'd done all this, why she'd gone so far beyond her job, why she'd cared so much. Nia thought about it. Then she said, "Because everyone deserves a chance to heal, and because she'd needed someone to believe in her once too." And Marcus reminded her of that. Marcus thanked her, his voice thick with emotion. He said she'd saved his life. Nia said no. She said he'd saved his own life. She'd just been there to help him see it. As the months went on, Marcus's vision remained stable. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. They said the damage to his optic nerves hadn't progressed, and it might never. There were no guarantees, but for now, he could see. Marcus took nothing for granted. He cherished every moment with Zoe, every sunset, every smile. He started taking photographs, documenting everything, just in case. But he also stopped living in fear of what might happen. He focused on what was happening now. Gerald surprisingly reached out one day. He asked to meet, just the two of them. Marcus was hesitant, but he agreed. They met at a quiet restaurant, and for the first time in years, they talked like adults. Gerald didn't apologize, not exactly, but he said he'd underestimated Marcus. He said he'd thought keeping Marcus dependent was protecting him, but he saw now that it had only held him back. Marcus said he appreciated that, but he also said their relationship couldn't go back to what it was. He needed boundaries, and Gerald needed to respect them. Gerald nodded. He said he'd try. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. Time passed. Zoe grew older, thriving in school, full of life and curiosity. Shanice and Marcus co-parented smoothly, even becoming friends again, though they never tried to rekindle their romance. They'd both moved on, but they'd always have Zoe connecting them. Nia found a new position, working with another family, but she stayed in touch with Marcus. They met for coffee sometimes, and she loved hearing about his progress, about the life he was building. One day, Marcus called her with news. He'd been offered a partnership in a small consulting firm. It was a big step, a real career, and he was excited. Nia congratulated him, her pride evident. She said she always knew he had it in him. Marcus said there was something else. He'd started dating someone, a woman he'd met, through work. It was new, tentative, but it felt right. Nia was thrilled. She said he deserved happiness. Marcus agreed. He said for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was living, not just surviving. Years later, Marcus stood in Zoe's middle school watching her perform in a school play. She was confident, radiant, so different from the cautious little girl who'd first visited him all those years ago. Shanice sat beside him, and they smiled at each other, proud parents. After the play, Zoe ran up and hugged them both. She said she was glad they were both there. Marcus said he wouldn't miss it for the world. As they walked out together, Marcus thought about everything that had happened. The accident, the coma, the 5 years of darkness, the fear, the pain, the isolation, and then Nia, walking into his life and refusing to give up on him, helping him find his way back. He thought about his eyes, about the possibility that one day he might lose his sight. It still scared him, but he'd learned that life was full of uncertainties, and hiding from them didn't make them go away. The only thing that mattered was being present for the moments that counted. He looked at Zoe, laughing with her friends, full of life. He thought about all the things he'd almost missed, and he knew, without a doubt, that opening his eyes had been the best decision he'd ever made. That night, alone in his apartment, Marcus stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. He thought about calling Nia, thanking her again, but he'd done that so many times already. Instead, he just stood there, grateful, alive, and ready for whatever came next. He'd spent 5 years in darkness, but the light had been worth the wait. 3 years after that night at the window, Marcus sat in a different apartment, this one filled with Zoe's artwork on the walls and her backpack thrown carelessly by the door. She was 12 now, spending every other week with him, and the casual chaos of her presence made the place feel alive in a way he'd never imagined possible. He was cooking dinner, something he'd learned to do out of necessity and had grown to love, when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. The voice on the other end was familiar but older, worn down by time. It was Gerald. His father's voice was quieter than Marcus had ever heard it, missing the usual commanding edge. He said he was calling from a hospital. Nothing serious, he insisted quickly, just some heart issues the doctors wanted to monitor. But there was something else, something harder to say. He asked if Marcus would visit. Marcus's first instinct was to say no. Years had passed since their last conversation, years of limited contact and careful distance. But something in his father's voice, a vulnerability Marcus had never heard before, made him pause. He said he'd think about it. When Zoe came home from school that afternoon, she found Marcus sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. She asked what was wrong, and Marcus told her about the call. Zoe was quiet for a moment, then asked if he was going to go. Marcus said he didn't know. He said his father had hurt a lot of people, had made things so much harder than they needed to be. Zoe nodded, understanding more than most 12-year-olds would. Then she said something that surprised him. She said maybe people got scared too, just like he had been. Maybe his dad had been scared of losing him and didn't know how to show it. Marcus looked at his daughter, amazed at her wisdom. He said she might be right. The next day, Marcus drove to the hospital. He hadn't told Gerald he was coming. Wasn't even sure he'd go through with it until he was walking down the sterile hallway toward his father's room. Gerald looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished somehow. His silver hair was disheveled, and for the first time, Marcus saw his father as an old man, not the imposing figure who dominated his life for so long. Gerald's eyes widened when Marcus walked in. He started to speak, probably to say something dismissive or businesslike, but Marcus held up a hand. He said he hadn't come to fight. He said he'd come because, despite everything, Gerald was still his father. And because Zoe had reminded him that fear made people do terrible things. Gerald's face crumpled in a way Marcus had never seen. His father, this man who'd never shown weakness, who'd built an empire on being unshakable, started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears running down weathered cheeks. He said he'd been terrified when Marcus was in the coma, sitting by his bedside every single day, watching machines breathe for him, wondering if his son would ever wake up. He said when Marcus did wake up but wouldn't open his eyes, it felt like a rejection, like Marcus had chosen to shut him out specifically. Gerald said he'd handled it all wrong. He'd tried to control everything because that was the only way he knew how to protect people. He said he'd driven away Marcus's mother years before the helicopter crash, had driven away everyone who'd ever mattered, because he didn't know how to love without smothering. He said he was sorry. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He said he'd been angry at his father for years, and some of that anger was justified. But he also said he understood now, in a way he couldn't have before. He understood how fear could trap you, how it could make you do things that hurt the people you loved. He said he'd spent 5 years with his eyes closed because he was terrified of facing the world. Gerald had spent a lifetime pushing people away because he was terrified of losing them. Different responses to the same fear. They talked for hours, really talked, maybe for the first time ever. Gerald asked about Zoe, about Shanice, about Marcus's work. Marcus showed him pictures on his phone, and Gerald studied each one carefully, hungrily, like he was trying to memorize a life he'd been shut out of. When visiting hours ended and Marcus had to leave, Gerald asked if he could see Zoe sometime. Not to interfere, not to control anything, just to know his granddaughter. Marcus said he'd talk to Shanice about it. He said he couldn't make any promises, but he'd try. As he walked back to his car, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, or at least not complete forgiveness, but something like understanding. His phone buzzed with a text from Nia. She'd heard through Mrs. Brennan that Gerald was in the hospital and was checking if Marcus was okay. He smiled and called her instead of texting back. When she answered, he told her about the visit, about the conversation, about how strange it felt to see his father vulnerable. Nia said she was proud of him for going. She said it took strength to face someone who'd hurt you, especially when you didn't owe them anything. Marcus said he'd been thinking about her a lot lately, about how she'd been the catalyst for everything good in his life now. He said he wanted to do something for her, to give back even a fraction of what she'd given him. Nia laughed and said he didn't owe her anything. She said seeing him happy, seeing him living fully, was payment enough. But Marcus insisted. He said he'd been working with the consulting firm, and they were expanding, looking for someone to head up their human resources department. Someone who understood people, who knew how to see past surfaces to what someone really needed. He said he'd thought of her immediately. Nia went quiet. Then she said she was happy in her current position, working with another family. But there was something in her voice, a hesitation that made Marcus press. He asked if she was really happy or just comfortable. Nia sighed. She admitted that the work was starting to feel repetitive, that she'd been thinking about a change but hadn't known what that would look like. Marcus said she should at least come in for an interview. No pressure, no obligations, just a conversation. 3 weeks later, Nia started her new job. She was nervous at first, worried she didn't have the formal qualifications. But Marcus had been right. She was incredible at it. He said he hadn't come to fight. He said he'd come because, despite everything, Gerald was still his father. And because Zoe had reminded him that fear made people do terrible things. Gerald's face crumpled in a way Marcus had never seen. His father, this man who'd never shown weakness, who'd built an empire on being unshakable, started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears running down weathered cheeks. He said he'd been terrified when Marcus was in the coma, sitting by his bedside every single day, watching machines breathe for him, wondering if his son would ever wake up. He said when Marcus did wake up but wouldn't open his eyes, it felt like a rejection, like Marcus had chosen to shut him out specifically. Gerald said he'd handled it all wrong. He'd tried to control everything because that was the only way he knew how to protect people. He said he'd driven away Marcus's mother years before the helicopter crash, had driven away everyone who'd ever mattered, because he didn't know how to love without smothering. He said he was sorry. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He said he'd been angry at his father for years, and some of that anger was justified. But he also said he understood now, in a way he couldn't have before. He understood how fear could trap you, how it could make you do things that hurt the people you loved. He said he'd spent 5 years with his eyes closed because he was terrified of facing the world. Gerald had spent a lifetime pushing people away because he was terrified of losing them. Different responses to the same fear. They talked for hours, really talked, maybe for the first time ever. Gerald asked about Zoe, about Shanice, about Marcus's work. Marcus showed him pictures on his phone, and Gerald studied each one carefully, hungrily, like he was trying to memorize a life he'd been shut out of. When visiting hours ended and Marcus had to leave, Gerald asked if he could see Zoe sometime. Not to interfere, not to control anything, just to know his granddaughter. Marcus said he'd talk to Shanice about it. He said he couldn't make any promises, but he'd try. As he walked back to his car, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, or at least not complete forgiveness, but something like understanding. His phone buzzed with a text from Nia. She'd heard through Mrs. Brennan that Gerald was in the hospital and was checking if Marcus was okay. He smiled and called her instead of texting back. When she answered, he told her about the visit, about the conversation, about how strange it felt to see his father vulnerable. Nia said she was proud of him for going. She said it took strength to face someone who'd hurt you, especially when you didn't owe them anything. Marcus said he'd been thinking about her a lot lately, about how she'd been the catalyst for everything good in his life now. He said he wanted to do something for her, to give back even a fraction of what she'd given him. Nia laughed and said he didn't owe her anything. She said seeing him happy, seeing him living fully, was payment enough. But Marcus insisted. He said he'd been working with the consulting firm, and they were expanding, looking for someone to head up their human resources department. Someone who understood people, who knew how to see past surfaces to what someone really needed. He said he'd thought of her immediately. Nia went quiet. Then she said she was happy in her current position, working with another family. But there was something in her voice, a hesitation that made Marcus press. He asked if she was really happy or just comfortable. Nia sighed. She admitted that the work was starting to feel repetitive, that she'd been thinking about a change but hadn't known what that would look like. Marcus said she should at least come in for an interview. No pressure, no obligations, just a conversation. 3 weeks later, Nia started her new job. She was nervous at first, worried she didn't have the formal qualifications. But Marcus had been right. She was incredible at it. His door. She looked troubled, and he immediately asked what was wrong. She said she'd gotten a call from her ex-husband. He'd been absent from their daughter's life for years, but now he wanted back in. He was claiming he'd changed, that he deserved a second chance. Nia didn't know what to do. Marcus listened, and when she finished, he asked what her gut told her. Nia said her gut told her not to trust him, but she also knew people could change, had seen it happen. She was torn. Marcus said he couldn't tell her what to do, but he could share what he'd learned. He said change was possible, but it had to be demonstrated, not just claimed. He said his relationship with Gerald was still fragile, still rebuilding because trust took time. He said if her ex wanted back in his daughter's life, he needed to prove he was serious. Small steps, supervised visits, consistency over time. Not grand promises, but steady action. Nia nodded slowly. She said that made sense. She thanked him and turned to leave. But Marcus called her back. He said she'd given him that same grace once, the chance to prove he could change. He said she'd believed in him when no one else did, and that had made all the difference. He said whatever she decided about her ex, he'd support her. Nia smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. She said she knew that. She said that's what friends did. As the years continued to pass, Marcus's vision remained stable. The predicted deterioration never came. His doctors were amazed, unable to fully explain why the damage hadn't progressed. Marcus didn't question it. He just remained grateful for every day he could see. He watched Zoe grow into a confident teenager, watched Gerald slowly earn a place in her life, watched his relationship with Shanice evolve into genuine friendship. He watched Nia thrive in her career, eventually becoming a partner in the firm. He watched the city change outside his window, seasons shifting, buildings rising, life moving forward. and he realized that the thing blocking his eyes all those years hadn't been physical at all. It had been fear, guilt, and the mistaken belief that hiding from pain would make it hurt less. Opening his eyes hadn't just been about seeing the world again. It had been about choosing to participate in life, with all its uncertainty and risk. It had been about believing he deserved to be present for the moments that mattered. It had been about trusting that even if the worst happened, even if he lost his vision someday, the memories he'd created would carry him through. On Zoe's 15th birthday, they threw a party at Marcus's apartment. Shanice was there with her new partner, someone kind and steady, who Zoe genuinely liked. Gerald was there, quieter than he used to be, but present in a way that mattered. Nia was there with her daughter, the two families blending easily. Mrs. Brennan even stopped by with a gift, smiling in a way Marcus had never seen during those dark years in the penthouse. As Marcus watched everyone laughing together, eating cake, celebrating, he felt Nia beside him. She said this was a good life he'd built. Marcus said it was a good life they'd built. He said none of it would have existed if she hadn't walked into that penthouse 5 years ago and refused to accept that his eyes would stay closed forever. Nia said she'd just been doing her job. Marcus said no. She'd been doing something much more important. She'd been seeing him, really seeing him, even when he couldn't see himself. They stood together watching the party, and Marcus thought about that night so long ago when he'd finally opened his eyes and saw Nia's face looking back at him with nothing but belief and compassion. He thought about all the faces he'd seen since then, Zoe's, Shanice's, Gerald's, his own in the mirror, no longer marked by defeat but by something harder won and more valuable. Hope. The party continued around them, life in all its messy, beautiful complexity, and Marcus smiled. His eyes were wide open, and he was finally, truly seeing. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.